Okay. Hello, everybody. It was new. So I love all the conversation that's going on, but we have, there we go. Thank you very much. We have a very interesting program for today. We are thrilled to bring back Philip Lacovara and to talk about what has happened in the past year. Some of you may have been at his presentation that was back in December of 24, which was before the inauguration that occurred just over a month ago now. And so we're thrilled to have him back. I'm Kathy Kozik. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Sanibel, and we are a nonpartisan organization. And what does that mean? Well, that means that we will not support a particular candidate, will not fight against a particular candidate who's running for office. We do, however, take positions. We take positions because our mission is to empower voters, and this program is a piece of that, giving voters the ability to hear facts, which are so hard to piece apart these days. So sharing facts with all of you, and hopefully you can go forth and share some of the facts you learn as well with your friends and neighbors. And we also are defenders of democracy. And these days, what that really means is that we take the Constitution to heart. I think I have a copy of the Constitution. I do. Sitting on your table are copies of the Constitution. And one of the things that I find most rewarding these days is wherever I bring these kinds of copies, I always run out, always. And it doesn't matter who the audience is, I always run out of our Constitution, because you can tell that people care. People want to understand what are our laws? What are the foundations of who we are as a country? And this is it. So before we get started officially with the program, I also do want to share that our next program, and I think there's flyers on every table, plus you can find it. It was in our newsletter. It'll be on our Facebook shortly because I forgot to put it up there. But anyhow, our next one is on freedom of the press, and we've got a great panel of folks who will be joining us for that. And hot news, hot off the presses, is that our April program will be with the acting supervisor of elections for Lee County. Had a great conversation with Chief Deputy SOE Bernie Feliciano on Monday, and talked to her about the fact that people are afraid. Are we going to have free and fair elections, or are we not? What is the world going to look like? And so she's going to come. She's going to do some myth busting. And there are some things that she probably can't myth bust yet, because the general session for the legislation here in Florida ends in mid-March. But then they have another session that will be in April that will look more at redistricting, which, by the way, is prohibited by our Florida Constitution, but to look at redistricting as well as a number of other things, hot buttons for the governor. So she won't be able to myth bust everything, but she can at least talk about all the things that we hear, like the actions in Fulton County in Georgia just last week. So that should be a very interesting program as well. So we're very much looking forward to that. But I want to get on to the main event for today. Philip Lacovara has had a fabulous career. If there's anybody who has the background to speak to this, it is Philip. He, one of his first roles officially out of law school was to be an assistant to Thurgood Marshall before he joined the Supreme Court. He was I have to get the official title of it. Deputy Solicitor General for the United States. And while he was in that position, this was during the Nixon administration, he was assigned to the special counsel, a special prosecutor for Watergate. And I believe you actually got to hand a subpoena to Richard Nixon somewhere along the line as well. So that must have been a really red letter day. He was also appointed by President Reagan to the District of Columbia Judicial Nomination Committee. And, you know, I think really the biggest takeaway, this is a quote from someone, is that he is an outspoken defender of the rule of law. And that is what we have not seen this past year. So without further ado,
thank you for that.
There we go.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. So one of the things you can take away from that is I'm very old.
we talked about September. Sorry about this. I'll turn this down. Try it again. See if that's any better.
Just going to use the mic.
You want to use this mic? I break mics. Oh no, and I really did. Hello, hello, hello. It's a green light. Like I said, I break things.
Well, let me start. I'll try to speak loudly. And if you can't hear me, just wave your hands. Hope my voice will project. As you can tell from the opening slide here, I have a very different point of view about the last year.
There we go. We're getting feedback off the lavalier, and this one's not back to not turning on.
It's locked on right now. Yeah, they flip over each other, so lavaliers gonna clip over this every time.
Okay.
So here, I got it on, or
I got it on.
On and the lavalier off.
Thank you.
and I'm just turned off right now.
There we go.
Good. So what I'm going to be talking about is not very subtle, and I know you're a sophisticated audience, so much of what I'm going to be saying to you is information that you've already heard, but I thought it would be useful to put it in one place so you have a sense of where we are, where we're going. What I've pointed out as my theme is that Trump 2.0, that is the current administration, is fundamentally different even from Trump 1.0, the first Trump administration. And my observation today is that we have fundamentally changed America just in 1 year. As you know, 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the creation of our country, 1776, the Declaration of Independence. And my point is, America is not simply a territory. It's not just a collection of 330 odd million people. It's not just an economy. America is an idea. And it's an idea that most of us in this room grew up having an intuition about. I go back to the earliest part of my consciousness, the late 1940s, early 1950s, and Superman was the dominant American history. And he summarized his approach to the world in 3 words. He stood for truth, justice, and the American way. And that resonated with people. People didn't have to ask themselves, what does that mean, truth, justice, and the American way? It was part of who we were, and we just learned this almost by osmosis as we were progressing. But let's go back to the foundation of the country to see where this idea of America comes from. It was laid out in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, that eloquent document. And it begins by saying some things are really obvious. They're fundamental. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. That's an important concept that we've grown up with. So the rights don't come from the government. They exist because we are human beings and we share that, independent of what the king thinks or independent of what the president thinks or what the president's aides want to think. And the Declaration of Independence goes on to explain the idea of government. What's government all about? What's its purpose? Governments are instituted among men and women, happily, to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted and derive their just powers from the consent of the government. All that we can say about the idea of America is captured in those few words. Government is about justice. It's about protecting the rights that derive from our humanity. When they got around to forming a new government, 1787, in the Constitution, they began with a preamble explaining how they're going to go about this, confirming, codifying that the goal of government is to ensure domestic tranquility, establish justice, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. And they created a government for that purpose. That was part of the idea of government in America, to achieve certain definable objectives. When they were selling this idea to the American people during the ratification process, in the Federalist Papers, with which you're familiar, the various commentators, Jay and Madison and Hamilton, explained how they thought they could go about forming a government that would pursue these objectives. And they said a couple of things are obvious. One is the government has to be able to control the population. That's part of domestic tranquility, law and order. But then they said, you must also enable the government to control the government, and next, to oblige it to control itself. And they weren't just laying down platitudes about the importance about government being controlled. They had an idea, a structural idea, how they would implement this. And you've all learned about this in high school civics. Unfortunately, as we'll see, not everybody currently staffing the government seems to have taken this seriously, at least in 2025 and 2026. They decided that the best way to prevent government from abusing its powers is to make sure that the several constituent parts, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, would, by their mutual relations, have a way of keeping each other in check. This notion of separation of powers and checks and balances is essential to the idea of government in America. Then they left nothing to doubt about what they thought would be the rights, fundamental rights about how all persons would be treated in America. Note the key noun, no person, not no citizen, no person in this country will be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That use of the term person is quite deliberate because elsewhere the Constitution talks about citizens in some respects, but for the most part, they were carrying forward the idea that all human beings in this country have rights and essentially the same rights to treatment by their government. They also, later on, after the struggle over slavery, culminating in the Civil War, adopted a series of amendments to reaffirm the idea of America, which had been imperfectly executed thanks to the tolerance of slavery in the original document. In the 13th Amendment, they outlawed slavery absolutely. And in the 14th Amendment, they assured that anyone born in this country is a citizen of the United States. Not just slaves. They didn't say any former slaves. They said any person born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. And all persons who are citizens or naturalized are entitled to the equal protection of the law. Equal protection of the law. Fast forward, and there are other key documents that you can look to capture the idea of what America is about. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is still worth reading. Many people memorized it in high school as part of a process for a speech or debate. Contains some wonderful ideas about the purpose of government being for the benefit of the people, by the people, and for the people. And Lincoln expressed the hope that had been recently documented thanks to the battles at Gettysburg. And he expressed the hope that those ideals would not vanish from the earth, that government would be of the people, by the people, and critically, for the people. Shortly after that, during the wave of immigration that followed the Civil War, during which the ancestors of many of us in this room came to the United States before America began restricting the immigration to keep out people like my grandparents and perhaps like yours. We got from France this wonderful statue that stands in the harbor in New York. If you've ever sailed into New York after an ocean crossing, it's impossible not to have your heart swell with this vivid expression of America, the Statue of Liberty. And some years later, they put on the statue the plaque from Emma Lazarus's poem, again, trying to capture the idea that led so many millions of people to come to America from countries all around the world. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. Not just Norwegians, even people from S-hole countries. That's what Emma Lazarus was talking about, and that's what's on the Statue of Liberty. Let's not forget that, even if others do. But again, as with slavery, we knew that equal rights in the North, for example, where I grew up, were largely an abstract concept, but not really accepted or implemented in practice. And in much of the South, the idea was not even accepted in theory, equal rights being systematically denied for nearly a century after the Civil War. And we passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Some of you may remember those days, the struggles that led up to the Civil Rights Act. But once again, we have an encapsulation of one of the ideas of America. No person shall be denied equal protection of the law or denied benefits because of, or equal treatment because of race, gender, religion, sexual orientation. And then those of us who grew up after World War II just took for granted that America was part of a new international order, an order of rules-based, a system that was intended to protect rights and maintain peace by recognizing certain standards had to be respected, even by countries that had the power to violate them or disregard them. So no longer was it to be the strong who could do what they will. It was to be respect for the weak and the small, as well as the rich and the powerful. And the United States was the leader in this system in which we grew up, with a system of alliances with other freedom-loving nations. including but not limited to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was the world that I knew and that I think you knew as America, the America that we so cherish. If you've seen the musical Hamilton, you've probably heard the song based upon the 17th century British ballad that was supposedly played by Cornwallis's troops as they were marching out of Yorktown after being defeated in the Revolutionary War. Yet let's be content and the times lament, you see the world turned upside down. That's the way the retreating British troops saw it as America achieved its independence from the then most powerful nation on earth. Where are we today? It's a wonderful essay by Anne Applebaum in The Atlantic, the end of last year. And I think she sums it up rather crisply. Perhaps expecting Americans to live up to the extraordinary ideals that they proclaimed in the 18th century was always unreasonable, but that language nevertheless shaped the way we thought about ourselves. Now we live in a world where America is led by people who have abandoned these ideals altogether. I happen to agree with her. You may or may not, but I want to explain some of the reasons why I think that's an accurate description of how America is fundamentally different today over the past year from what we grew up thinking about America. Start with the presidency. One of the hallmarks of an authoritarian leader, as distinct from a leader who is merely, as the Constitution says about the president, faithfully executing the law, is that he governs by decree, executive orders. The president decides how people will behave without the nicety of congressional legislation, without even the nicety of discussion. Sorry. One of the other hallmarks of an authoritarian presidency is that the government power is used not primarily for the benefit of the people. Remember, that's what the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the Constitution said was the purpose of government for the general welfare of the citizenry. But in an utterly unprecedented degree, this administration, this president, has achieved the use of government power for enormously enriching himself and his family, irrespective of any benefits to the public at large. Different publications have calculated different amounts. I think the New Yorker said $4 billion just yesterday or 2 days ago. It's about $4 billion in added wealth, cash or benefits achieved by the president, $7 billion in the appreciation of other assets. And this extends, of course, not only to the president personally, but to his family. So nepotism has become the official ingredient in the exercise of presidential power. How is this possible? When the framers had carefully framed a separation of powers with checks and balances? Well, it depends, of course, on the unwillingness of the other two branches to do their jobs, to keep the executive in check. We have a pusillanimous Congress. And unfortunately, although there are some members of Congress who agree with the president's stated policies to the extent they are discernible, many, or perhaps most, when you hear people talk candidly, are simply afraid. They're afraid to challenge the president. You've seen them driven out of office. Republicans, I'm talking about Republican leaders who refused to run for re-election because President Trump would primary them, or they have resigned because of the attacks that they faced because of the president. So you have a cowed Congress. Side by side, the other branch is equally deferential. Back in December of 2024, I referred, among other things, to the president's prevailing on the creation of immunity to commit federal crimes, something that in my view, no reasonable person with any sense of history or constitutional principle could have accepted, and yet it was adopted by 6 members of the Supreme Court. In the last year, other extraordinary examples of the court's willingness to defer to the president are illustrated by just another piece of data. As the lower courts have tried to restrain the president's excesses, the Supreme Court has regularly stepped in on an emergency basis to let him get away with whatever he wants to get away with, even when they haven't yet been able to decide definitively whether he's right or wrong. They've said, well, you can do it until we get around to ruling. That, in my view, is not the rule of law. It's the rule of chaos. Then you look around throughout the rest of the government that was supposed to be established for our benefit. Some of you may have seen the wonderful Netflix series that was on last year called Death by Lightning, about the stalking and assassination of James A. Garfield, based on Candace Millard's equally wonderful book. As a result of Garfield's assassination by Charles Guiteau, always described in history as a, quote, disappointed office seeker, close quote, Congress in 1883 passed the Civil Service Act. That's been in effect for 140 years, professionalizing the civil service so that irrespective of changes in presidential administrations, the government would carry on with objectivity, consistency, professionalism, loyalty not to a particular figurehead, but to the American people itself, according to the laws enacted on their behalf by Congress. That system has been systematically overturned by President Trump in the last year. Not only have civil servants at all levels been fired thanks to Elon Musk and his band of happy young warriors, but even the federal regulatory agencies, again, an institutional structure that goes back to 1890, has been undone. And the simple solution that the president decided to pursue was disregarding the uniform structure of these regulatory agencies like the Federal Trade Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Consumer Product Safety Commission and the Consumer Finance Protection Board, and on and on and on. And that protection by Congress was that all of these multi-member agencies have at least minority party representation, typically 3 members of one party, 2 members of another party, and they could not be replaced except for misconduct. And that was to, again, guarantee a degree of stability and objectivity and professionalism. Supreme Court has consistently stayed any efforts by the lower courts to prevent President Trump from removing Democratic members of these agencies, although it hasn't yet ruled finally on this approach. But most of us expect that when the court finally rules later this term, sometime this spring, as it is, in a case called Humphrey's Executor that goes back to the 1930s, where the Supreme Court ruled unanimously, Republicans and Democrats, far right and liberal or progressive members of the court back in the 1930s said, of course Congress has the power to create agencies with protected tenure. I think everyone expects that this Supreme Court will overrule that decision, almost 100 years old. For me, particularly distressing is the perversion of the justice system. dismantling the Justice Department, firing the people who were career officials, and importantly in such divisions as civil rights, environmental protection, public integrity, and instead installing in the highest places President Trump's personal lawyers as Solicitor General and Deputy Attorney General, and our former Attorney General of Florida, Pam Bondi. Enough said. And then, in a rather malicious irony, you might say, well, President Trump complained for years that he was being targeted and that the forces of law are being weaponized against him, something that I think is simply not true. He has officially decided to weaponize the forces of law to go after his political opponents or people he perceived as political opponents. And this has gotten down, as you know, to firing everybody who was in any way involved in any investigation of President Trump or his allies, including down to the level of paralegals in the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In order to make sure, if possible, that the courts couldn't block his efforts, he's attacked the courts systematically. And this is not just rhetoric, not just criticism, not just decrying Biden courts or left-wing, lefty progressive courts or courts that supposedly were suffering from Trump delusion syndrome or some of these other catchy names that his advisors make up for to put on social media. But he's also seeing to it that his aides systematically disregard, ignore, flout orders of the courts. That's something that has not ever happened in this country, certainly not except on a one-off, maybe exceptional basis somewhere briefly. Last week, a judge in Minneapolis, about which more, totaled up and concluded that in just the month of January alone, ICE had disregarded 100 court orders. And he said, that's more in 1 month than any other agency that he could think of had violated in its entire existence. And this is simply illustrative of the effort by the administration and the people put in place by this administration to try to defang one of the coordinate branches of government, the principal instrument for upholding the rule of law, the federal courts. You only need to turn on your television to see other hallmarks of how different America is today from what it has been through our lifetime and beyond. The military, National Guard, regular Army troops patrolling Los Angeles, Washington, Minneapolis, Portland, San Francisco. Is that the America that we knew? The pardon power. Let's ask a question about corruption. Not only did the president issue a blanket pardon, irrespective of the actual violent crimes committed by the 2,000 plus people prosecuted in connection with the January 6th riots, he's also systematically used the pardon power to issue pardons to his major political donors, people who contributed to his PAC, which is now the largest. He's a lame duck, but he has the largest PAC in history, thanks to money that is flowing to him for his benefit. I'm not going to say much about the undermining of the free press because you're going to be hearing more on that subject at the next conference that Kathy mentioned. But you've seen it all. It's the effort to defang the so-called fourth estate that's supposed to provide information that holds the government accountable. And then in an effort to roll back a lot of the initiatives that were passed to pursue the goals of equal protection and civil rights and enhanced opportunities, there's been a systematic attack on the DEI programs, but not just DEI programs, if you read any of the press accounts, you'll see that the National Park Service has been directed to remove any notations in national parks that refer to slavery or the Underground Railroad or anything that might remind people that our idea of America was imperfectly executed and is still being the subject of striving. All of this is viewed as inconsistent with the Trumpian idea of redoing the image of America in his image. I passed quickly over the roundup of immigrants, our gardeners, our construction workers, our landscapers, our painters, all of these people being rounded up. You've seen it. You've seen ICE in the streets of our major cities. Minneapolis is simply the latest example. And we're not talking about one-off exercises. We're talking about massive incursions. I heard this morning Tom Homan, who's now heading the ICE operation in Minneapolis, said they're going to be withdrawing 700 of the ICE and Border Patrol agents from Minneapolis, leaving 2,000. That's 3 times the size of the entire Minneapolis police force. You've seen on your televisions the killing of 2 women, of Ms. Good and Alex Preddy, by ICE agents, 2 American citizens trying to stand up to protect their fellow citizens, whether here or visitors, migrants who may not have papers. And what is astonishing about this ICE feature is that the so-called big, beautiful bill that was passed last year allocates $75 billion for ICE. It is by far the largest federal law enforcement agency, dwarfing the FBI, for example. And they're recruiting another 10,000 agents to wear body armor, to carry the weapons of war. And they're recruiting at gun shows, and they're using right-wing influencers to recruit applicants for these positions. The tagline for the advertisements directed to hire the 10,000 agents is that they will be asked to perform their sacred duty to defend the homeland by repelling foreign invaders. Some of you may remember from history words like that in Europe 75 years ago. That is not America. So we have communities living in fear, Minneapolis being only one of them, only happens to be the most recent one. On the international level, instead of the alliance of the free and the freedom-loving, we have the president rolling out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin, and we have him almost simultaneously ejecting Volodymyr Zelensky from the White House, favoring the aggressor, evidently in place of the victim. Abandoning America's commitments abroad through various international programs, especially foreign aid programs, was a report today released by Lancet, the British medical journal, saying that as a result of the US administration's canceling of its aid programs and withdrawal from the World Health Organization, 9 million people will die between now and the end of the president's term who otherwise would not have done. That's life and death. This is not abstract politics. This is not political philosophy. This is life and death. Is this America? Engaging in foreign military operations that seem to be, in my view, reckless, certainly of dubious validity or wisdom. Venezuela, Iran, Nigeria, then the threats to invade Greenland. all of which comes under the heading of the powerful get to do whatever they want. Stephen Miller, the president's really chief advisor or gauleiter, was quoted as saying expressly, "We have the power, and this is a world in which power is the only thing that matters. If we want to take Greenland, we will." Or to deal with the supposed drug problem from Venezuela, we won't bother with the nicety of trying to arrest people and put them on trial and prove that they are drug smugglers. We'll use the military services to blow them up, guilty or innocent, apparently. A number of them are not even thought to have been drug smugglers. Fundamentally inconsistent with the idea of due process for all persons. You simply don't get to kill people because you think they're drug dealers. That is not what the American constitutional way is supposed to be. Where does this leave us? It's what Daniel Patrick Moynihan called the problem of deviancy. The more that you have deviant behavior that goes unchecked or unremarked, the easier it is for it to be accepted going forward. It's like dumbing down in the classroom. This is dumbing down of the American ideal. We can't leave it at that. David Brooks had a wonderful column last week. At the end of the week, he's leaving the Times to go to the Atlantic. And he said, in order to change the political world, you have to change the idea. He called it the spiritual climate. He didn't mean spiritual necessarily in the faith-based sense, but a sense of values. And that's what has to change. A sense of America. What is the America that we want to have, to restore, to pass along to our children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren in my case? It's the better versions of ourselves. Now, I've probably given you indigestion, but there's a little bit of Alka-Seltzer that I can wrap up with. When I was talking about this focus that I was going to provide with one of my daughters, she said, you can't possibly give a luncheon talk and leave people distressed and feeling hopeless and tearing their remaining hair out. And she said, think about the ways that you can explain that things can be changed. And she mentioned a phenomenon that I had personally not known about. It's called frogging, or was called frogging. Back in former times when people either outgrew their clothes or the clothes were beginning to fray a little bit, they could actually take apart the wool and then remake something. Maybe some of you are aware of this. And so my thought here is, I created this picture thanks to AI, of a lap robe being reformed into an American flag. And this is my basic message for this afternoon. The things that I've cataloged this afternoon are not necessarily irreversible. They can be taken and unraveled and reformulated. How do you do it? Not easy, but possible. Well, one of the things, of course, is elections. President Trump said right after he came into office, when he was explaining all these things, elections have consequences. Well, they do, for ill or for good. So elections are crucial. And one of the things that gives me some hope is the polls. And I've listed what as a kind of average of the most recent polls that I was able to discern. They vary to some degree, but essentially the American people, and that includes a significant number, not a majority, of course, of Republicans, but a huge majority, not only of Democrats, but of independents, are unhappy with the way the country is going. That is, I think the idea of America is still alive and well in the hearts and minds of most people. So the president's net approval rating is way, way underwater. That may have some consequences for these other two branches, the pusillanimous Congress For example, there have been a few stirrings recently. Congress did, over the president's objection, pass a statute requiring the disclosure of the Epstein files. The Senate almost passed a bill to block further unilateral action in Venezuela. Vice President Vance had to be called in to break a 50-50 tie. The House did vote to approve further Obama subsidies, despite the president's objection. And as we've seen just in the last 2 days or so, the Senate blocked funding for ICE and related agencies in order to demand that some of these most abusive practices be changed. And we're seeing some reaction to that already. Obviously, control in the change in control of the House of Representatives could have enormous consequences if that were to happen in November of this year. This could affect the funding for some of the programs that the president is pursuing, could force restoration of some programs as part of legislative compromises. I know President Trump has said he's worried about the consequences of losing control of the House because he foresees Trump impeachment 3.0. But as you heard, the legislature here in Florida is joining those in other parts of the country that are about to resort to an attempted gerrymandering in order to prevent the loss of the House. In the former times, gerrymandering was taking place on some level or other, but everybody winked at it. It was thought to be unacceptable politically, so you had to conceal it. Now it's brazenly promoted from the White House on down, and the president has threatened state legislators who refused to go along with it, including in, I think it was Indiana. The Supreme Court may be a little chastened. They did refuse to allow the president to call up the National Guard, to federalize the National Guard for crime control by a 6-3 margin, with the three sort of center-right justices joining the liberal or progressives. I am optimistic that court, by a majority, will strike down the president's blunderbuss tariff program as beyond his executive authority. And I am hopeful that they will uphold the text of the 14th Amendment that we looked at that says everybody born here is a citizen, period, end of story. How do we go about pursuing this? That's a wonderful poster that we got from a group in Baltimore. Don't just agonize, organize. And that's the key. This can take place on 3 different levels. That is, the role of those of us who care about America is something that could be implemented first at the individual level. Everybody in this room can do something. The picture here is of my wife and one of my daughters and me at a No Kings rally. These are signs that I made up. Nobody has less artistic talent than I do. Anybody can attend a rally for or against something. That can be done individually. Kathy mentioned that you're going to have the Deputy Superintendent of Elections coming. Nothing is more important than elections, but you've all heard election workers, election office employees have been driven out of office because of political pressure. It's important to support the electoral process, and that can be done by volunteering as poll watchers, providing support, emotional and political, for the people who are doing the jobs of making sure that elections at the local level are free and fair. That's something that can be done by everybody in this room. Communities. I just can provide a couple of examples of community organization. In places north and south, communities have organized against ICE facilities, using ICE as an example. And they've said, no, we think that sort of detention of men, women, and children on a massive scale, which Tom Homan, by the way, repeated today, remains the policy, mass deportation, quote unquote. And communities have said, no, we're not going to tolerate that. We're not going to participate in that by allowing those facilities to be built in our communities. Minneapolis, of course, is the great current example of a community standing up to say, no, enough, too much, not here, not anywhere. So communities can stand up, show that the deviancy stops here. This is not normal. This is not tolerable. And finally, there are organizations. The League of Women Voters is obviously one, but there are others, almost a countless number. They're springing up every day. I just mentioned two of these that came upon my desk recently. Veterans for Responsible Leadership, citizens, senior citizens, when I qualify for America. So supporting organizations, joining organizations that are pressing for a restoration of the American ideal is something that everyone in this room can do. After the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis a couple of weeks ago, the brilliant young poet Amanda Gorman penned a poem. Some of you may have read it, and I just excerpted some lines. Change is only possible and all the greater when the labor and bitter anger of our neighbors is moved by the love and better angels of our nature. Kintsugi, some of you are familiar with this. I know Kathy is. It's the Japanese art of taking broken pottery, something that seems to have been ruined, and putting it back together with a lacquer-based glue of silver and gold or platinum in it. And what you wind up with something that's more beautiful than ever. So it's a sign, a symbol, a concrete manifestation of the possibility of hope. And the hope is in your hands and in your hearts. Thank you very much.
So, what do you think? How about another round? So I have a couple of questions in hands. If you guys have questions, please, Deborah is collecting them and bringing them up to me. I'm going to start with one that I know was not meant as levity. So I'll say that right up front, but I'm going to use it for a little levity because I think we all need a deep breath and a little laugh. In honor of our 250th anniversary, has anybody considered pursuing the 25th Amendment?
Key thing about the 25th Amendment is that it was considered in Trump 1.0.
I think I'm sorry, I turned this one on. I think I could get both of them.
That's the amendment that allows a president to be removed or at least displaced for incompetence or physical inability or some other disabling problem. And this was tried or was considered by some of the cabinet members in the first Trump administration. The difference between then and now, of course, is that there were some people of substance. There were some serious people in the Trump cabinet the first time around, but he learned his lesson. Those of you who were at the wonderful presentation on Project 2025 a year ago or so know that in the interval during the years that he was out of power, he had teams of people led by the group that did Project 25, figuring out where he went wrong from his standpoint. And one was putting in people who might be independent minded, as some of those original cabinet members were. And instead, what he has done, among other things, in following that set of recommendations, put in only people who are abject acolytes. And one of the biggest disappointments for me is our former Senator Marco Rubio, who seemed to have been a serious-minded person and now spouts the most inane things that he knows are simply false. And so I do not think the 25th Amendment is likely to be the solution.
Sad but true. So this is a great one. To the extent that Trump succeeds in expanding presidential power, as he already has, do you ever see a future president, regardless of party, relinquishing that power?
This is the real problem, is summarized by the problem of deviancy. I was thinking about this very issue not long ago. I heard from one of my former students. I taught political science in New York at the university level, and one of my courses was on presidential power. And I remember in the 2008 campaign, among the things we talked about were President George W. Bush's frequent use of executive orders, which was controversial even then on a much smaller scale. And when Barack Obama won the presidency in the 2008 election, one of my students said enthusiastically, "Wow, so we're going to roll back all those abuses of presidential power, such as the use of executive orders improvidently or profligately." And I said, "I'm afraid the history is against you. It's hard to see any example in American history where a president has voluntarily relinquished power that a predecessor has arrogated to the presidential office." That's the problem with Trump. Whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, next time they can do pretty much the same thing, unless they've got both a clear message from the American people. We are repudiating this. We are directly repudiating this. And you have this change of the spiritual attitude, the values, or what the founders used to call virtue, political virtue. Unless you elect somebody who has the virtue that classical political scientists were thinking about, somebody who understands the idea of America and is willing not to use the power that might theoretically be available to them.
So, given how blatant the violations of the Constitution and rule of law are in this administration, why are there so many Republicans still supporting him? 39% is a big number.
That's really the most vexing question, because I could see Donald Trump, and I don't want to be too harsh, but sociopathic, narcissistic, kleptomaniac might be too harsh a diagnosis, but he is not alone. He has not only hundreds or thousands of people who are avidly doing his bidding in the administration, on the streets of Minneapolis and elsewhere, but he has, as you say, millions of people who still support him. And that, to me, is the distressing point. Psychologists and political scientists have offered many reasons. They've said populism, this version of populism, is actually a phenomenon that's taken root around the world. It consists of people who feel that the system has been unfair to them. For some reason, they're disadvantaged and they invent boogeymen. It was the Jews in Germany in the 1930s. It was the Tutsis or the Hutus in Rwanda and Burundi. We've seen lots of examples in which unthinkable things happen and are pursued on the part of otherwise reasonable neighbors. And one looks in vain to find out exactly what goes on to cause it. But it is a phenomenon, it is a real thing that many people are prepared to say, and we have a friend who is anti-abortion, and because Donald Trump has said he's opposing abortion, that's it. Nothing else matters. So there are people who are one issue. Immigration, people are concerned about immigration, and Biden let the borders open, which is true, largely. And anything that Trump does is okay as long as he's successful in closing the southern border. So I think it's a complex, a conjury of reasons, but it's a reality that can't be ignored. There are tens of millions of people prepared to say, it's okay with me. And one can also go back to the famous lament from the war, World War II. They came for the Jews, and I said nothing because I wasn't a Jew. And they came for the communists, and I said nothing because I wasn't a communist. And they came for the gypsies, and I said nothing because I wasn't a gypsy. And then they came for me. So I hope it doesn't come to that. I don't think that America is that far down the ladder, but it's not going to get back on level playing ground simply by ignoring it. So remember the famous line from the Apollo 13, failure is not an option. Doing nothing is not an option.
Totally agree. So this is a great one and very timely, given some of the things that are being said just this week. President Trump wants the executive branch to control elections, not just the executive branch. He wants just the Republicans to run the elections, based on what he said. Do you see any kind of legal pathway that would enable that to happen in the Supreme Court with that?
Well, legal pathway. That of course is part of the issue. The Constitution is pretty clear that elections are assigned to the states. The states are to set the time, manner, and method of elections, even for federal office. So that's explicit. Congress does pass some measures that deal with elections. There certainly is a basis in federal law to prevent fraud in elections because of the use of the mails and telecommunications facilities. So the imaginative, if you will, the maliciously imaginative lawyers that President Trump has working for him can come up with theories to do this. I do not think even that this Congress will do that. And I don't think the courts would allow the president, even the Supreme Court, I do not think the Supreme Court would allow the president to seize control of the electoral process simply on his own say. So I do not think that is a real risk in the absence of congressional legislation, which itself would be dubious. And I don't think that legislation is likely.
Thank you. So continuing on the theme, and it seems that inevitably that Trump will challenge the congressional election, whatever happens. It's already started yapping about some of the people who've won just in special elections. What is the leverage for everybody in this room and all their friends and neighbors to stop that, to raise their voices appropriately? You've talked about no kings. What else? What other tools do we have?
Well, I think this ties in directly with what I said a moment ago. The integrity of elections depends on the people on the ground at the polling places and at the election counting facilities, the county clerk's offices or the superintendent of elections offices and so on, to make sure that people are watching. Stealing an election is something that has to happen in the dark. And if you have honest, honorable people, you and your neighbors watching, it's much harder to make an argument that the election has been stolen. And then when the returns are counted, there has to be the kind of support that was, I think, lacking, except on the part of the federal courts. As you know, in 60 some odd cases, including Trump-appointed judges as well as Democratic-appointed judges, judges said the election was fair. There was no systematic miscounting of ballots or construction of ballots. But a lot of the election workers themselves were left hanging high and dry, or at least they felt that way, and many of them have left. That's another area where I think it's important for ordinary, everyday citizens like us to stand up and be counted and say, we were there. We know this process was fair. And when you have that voice being expressed, it tends to undermine the ability of our other neighbors who want to say, oh, if Trump loses or Vance loses or whoever, it must have been because it was stolen. Say to your neighbors, no, it wasn't. I was there. Or I talked to Charlie and Jane and they were there. And all those votes were counted honestly.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things I would add to that is that last year I had the opportunity to sit in the canvassing process here in Lee County. And that's the process by which they actually review questionable ballots. They look at signatures, they look at, well, half the ballot was in checks and the other half was in X's. What was the voter's intent? And it was a very transparent process. And all of us can sign up as poll watchers or election judges or participate in the canvassing process. So you actually can see our elections in progress. And I do have to say that, and I'll repeat this when Bernie is here, it was amazing to watch it walk through things because it was fair and balanced. So think about that. They're actively looking for people to work in polling places, sign up. So this is a good question. Do you think there's a tipping point where things will go too far and that 39% that are still hanging on will let go and say, no, this has to stop?
I think the answer is yes. We've seen a couple of tipping points. Venezuela, surprisingly enough, was one of them. People were shaking their heads. Some of the MAGA people who don't like American involvement in foreign affairs said, why are we doing this? Why are we bombing Nigeria, for heaven's sake? Or why are we going to war with Iran again? So for different reasons, people may peel off. Minneapolis, I think, is another quasi-turning point. At least recent polls have indicated that even people who generally are supporting strong immigration enforcement, whatever that means, have said, gee, we're really not comfortable with having these people wearing combat gear with the label police on their back, go in and drag people around, push them down in the streets, and then shoot them. So I think we are approaching several tipping points that can significantly reduce the intensity of the level of commitment that 39% has.
Thank you. How can we strengthen, looking forward? Let's say we get a more balanced Congress after the midterms this year. How can we strengthen and fix the checks and balances in the system so we don't end up in the same situation where the three sides of government are not under control?
30 seconds.
Yes, in one sentence or more. I've got an answer to that. Give me 1.5 minutes. As Kathy mentioned, I was involved in Watergate. I was the counsel to the Watergate special prosecutor. And after the smoking gun tape was released because of the Supreme Court decision that Nixon had to turn it over, Nixon left office and everybody in the country breathed a collective sigh of relief. Watergate is over. The system won. The system works. I went around the country saying, no, that's too simple-minded. I was a little bit more gentle then. What I said was, the system only works if you've got the right people in the system. Now, in Watergate, you had a man of integrity, a man named Elliot Richardson, largely forgotten to history. Some of you may know him. He was being nominated to be Attorney General after John Mitchell had been forced out of the role of Attorney General. And Mitchell and Elliot Richardson given his word to the Senate Judiciary Committee that he would appoint a special prosecutor if he was appointed, confirmed by the Senate, as he was. And he picked Archie Cox, a man of great probity, not a professional prosecutor. He was a labor law professor. But he was a man who understood the Constitution, and he understood the law, and he understood his mission, which was to conduct a full, honest, thorough, no holds barred investigation. The right man for the job. He got fired by Nixon in the so-called Saturday Night Massacre, and he was replaced by Leon Jaworski, absolutely opposite person from Cox. Tough, Texas trial lawyer, no holds barred as well, political operative, but he also was not going to let the president monkey with him, and he was going to pursue the investigation. Change any of those factors, any of those people, and you wind up with a different result, and Richard Nixon would have served his second full term. It's the people that they say about elections, it's the economy, it's the people. You can change people in Congress and you can change the party in Congress if you don't have the people who are courageous, who are strong, who are independent, and who have a sense of what America is supposed to be. You can change only, as my high school English teacher used to say when he heard a silly question from one of his students, sort of shook his head, only the faces change. Well, that could be the problem unless the faces are faces of different people rather than different faces of the same pusillanimous people.
It's a good word. It's one of those things to make sure you've all added it to your vocabulary today. This is an interesting one. Why do you think big law and some universities folded so quickly?
Oh, I love this subject. I have been retired from active law practice for many years. Over the past 9 months, I have written 5 briefs as amici curiae on this very subject, starting from scratch, something I hadn't done in maybe 20 years, defending those law firms in court that refused to knuckle under to Donald Trump and went to court to say, the president can't tell us whom we're going to represent. He can't punish us. He can't refuse to allow us in federal buildings while we're representing clients. He can't take away security clearances simply because we're representing people doing DEI hiring or defending civil rights organizations. Big law, some of the big law collapsed and some of the universities collapsed. Money, simply money. They thought they could make more money by capitulating than not. Saw an article 2 days ago, one of the great law firms that I used to know and work with, the oldest surviving major law firm in America, Cadwalader, Wickersham and Taft in Wall Street, founded 1792, was one of the firms that capitulated, and they, along with others, had enough partners say, we cannot live in a firm that's prepared to do this kind of deal in order to avoid having Donald Trump try to take away some of our clients. And the firm has had to merge into, and therefore will soon disappear, merge into a European firm, in fact, and it will soon disappear after 230 years. They made a bad bet, but the reason for the bet was purely financial. And the same is true about some of the universities. And I put my money where my mouth is. I told my universities, you paid $200 million to Donald Trump. You're not getting it from me.
Love that. There's one university in my house that won't get any money from me either, what they did. So I'm going to use this as the second to last question that's written, because we are over time.
I was on time.
You were on time. You were on time, totally. So I'll blame it on all of you. Let's see. Interesting. Overruling Roe looked like judges doing politics instead of judicial work. And essentially all they seemed to be doing was fulfilling the president's campaign principles and promises, and celebrating their appointment. But don't conservative values mean honoring the decisions of the past? The originalism that Sam Alito is so famous for quoting, as is Clarence Thomas. How do they make that right in their heads? Any idea?
There's an easy answer and a hard answer. The easy answer is they were doing the president's bidding. I think that's an exaggeration, frankly. I disagree with much of what the Supreme Court has done. I do think, though, that Roe may be unique in the court's jurisprudence because from the moment it was decided, it was controversial. One of the things that has typically been viewed as the principal basis for re-examining a Supreme Court precedent is from the first moment it was announced, people said, you know what, that doesn't make sense, or that doesn't really have a basis in American history or the text of the Constitution or whatever. And therefore, over time, and this has happened repeatedly throughout American history, the court said, you know what, that decision was simply wrong, and we should get it right to the extent that we can. And Roe, I think, fits into that category. There were people who thought it was wrongly decided, not so much as a matter of principle. There are many people who would say abortion should be more available than it was in 1973. That's not the same thing as saying the Supreme Court should have found that there was a constitutional right to abortion in the Constitution. Certainly nothing in the text suggested that. And the idea of a right of privacy was itself a newly created right, which had itself been widely criticized by political scholars. That only dated from the 1960s. So it was not as if Roe itself was part of the mainstream of American tradition, and then the overruling of Roe was simply a political piece of a political opportunism. I don't think that's true. I think people on the court who voted to overrule Roe were people who said the same thing long before they got on the Supreme Court. Now, you can say they were put on the Supreme Court in part because they had already announced their views, but I don't think it's accurate or fair to say that they overruled Roe in order to reward Donald Trump or anybody else, or the Republicans in general.
Thanks. So one last question, and I'm going to ask you to repeat probably some of the same things that you've already said, but I want people leaving this room feeling like they have a responsibility here, and they can take action. A, is there hope? And B, how do we ensure that it gets paid off?
Again, I am, believe it or not, congenitally hopeful. And I know it's when I turn on CNN in the morning or read my news feeds, it's hard to be hopeful. But I tried to end on a hopeful note because I genuinely believe that most Americans understand what I was talking about, at least if you ask them. And the key thing is to make it's what David Brooks was talking about. It's the spiritual reawakening. America has gone through, as you know, over its history, several religious reawakenings. What we need is a cultural values, American ethic reawakening. And that takes place in conversations at the dinner table, at the bridge club, on the tennis court, between points. And it is a way of having this build from the ground up. Leadership on this sort of thing can come from the top. We know it's not going to come from the top in this administration. Normally, we think of presidents as the consoler in chief or the ethicist in chief or so forth. That's a benign way of viewing a president. But basically, the backstop to all of that begins with each individual citizen, because of the things that each individual citizen can do, not only in the polling place, casting ballots, but also in setting the climate that says, this is what our country is all about. We want our country to be all about these values, and we're looking for people who are prepared to join with us in private life or in public office who will respect and promote these values.
Philip, thank you so much.
No, everybody I think that I'm really extremely appreciate. Thank you for this country.
Okay. And I'm skipping out completely. Thank you. So just a couple of last words. If you need a constitution, I'm the person to talk to, or your table. You can find them on your table. I will also add that one of the things you can do is join the League of Women Voters. They will keep you informed. If you join the League of Voters, pick Sanibel, but just so you know, the majority of the money goes to national, where they fight. And they do amicus briefs. They're very present in all of the lawsuits. It goes to state where they go to Tallahassee, and then it comes to us as well, so we can continue to do these programs. So thank you all very much for coming. It's great to see you. Hope to see you on the 16th of March. Oh, fabulous. It was fabulous. I know there's gonna be a
I
list of
just
people.
have a couple of things. My name is Linda Lang, and I'm so pleased to see you have this senior citizen of America. I have a John Smith.
Well, we just had a Zoom call with from the
Yeah, from Pennsylvania. Yeah, he's in the Waverly. Anyway, so
small world.
small world. But thank you for having that up there. It's absolutely thrilled.
You're involved or do you?
I am.
Well, I'm